Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Helen Wilson, for those of you who don't know. I'm Vice President of Squirrel Hill Historical Society, and Michael Ehrman, our President, is still enjoying Florida. But he'll be back in a week, and I hope there's no blizzard to greet him. But anyway, welcome to our talk tonight, and I just have a few announcements. I hope you weren't too badly impacted by the parking problem, and we're going to face that again next month. And we do have some sort of a glitch in April in that our speaker, who is the Andy Warhol speaker, he himself isn't going to be able to come, but we're going to see if maybe somebody from the museum can still come. So we'll let you know. I was reminded to ask you that if you would like to have our announcements, please make sure we have your email address, and you can sign up at the back. Let's see. Those of you who didn't get the Squirrel Hill magazine, for some reason like me, there's extras in the back, so you can pick one up there. And we've also redone our brochure. One is Squirrel Hill History. It's just a very quick history of Squirrel Hill. And the other brochure is Squirrel Hill Historical Society and some information about us. And they're in the back also if you'd like to take them. The only other thing on my list is we are putting up the displays in Carnegie Library in Squirrel Hill now, and we've taken the first one down. And if you're interested, I put it over there. It's what was on the spot where that Carnegie Library was before the library was there. So that goes through history back to as far as we could find. So it's interesting if you'd like to take a look at it. Okay, now to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Peter Gilmore. He's an adjunct lecturer in history at Carlow University, instructor for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Pittsburgh, which is where I met him. And Carlow, he teaches courses including Irish American history and emergence of the modern West. And he's taught history of religion in Western Pennsylvania with Dr. Kathleen Parker, who is also here tonight. And she has talked about the Unitarians for us a few years ago. And let's see, during fall 2013, Dr. Gilmore served as postdoctoral teaching assistant at Carnegie Mellon University, the branch campus in Qatar. Wow, I didn't know that.
I've been there twice.
Wow, maybe that'll be a talk. So anyway, Dr. Gilmore didn't bring any of the books he's written here tonight, but they are online, they're on Kindle, and I asked him to say a few words about them because I think he'll do a better job of that than me. So anyway, here is Dr. Gilmore.
Thank you, Helen, and thank all of you for coming out. It's great to see so many. I'm delighted to be here. Before I get right into what it is that I've come to say, one little housekeeping question, and that is, I have about as many slides as I have minutes. So I'm not going to read the slides. I might occasionally refer to them. So that represents the audience participation portion of tonight's show, as it were. So, anyone who has spent any time at all walking, biking, driving around the East End, or anywhere in Western Pennsylvania for that matter, can't help but notice the remarkable profusion of Presbyterian churches. And so we have this question, how could it be that there are so many Presbyterians apparently, and so many Presbyterian churches, sometimes within blocks of one another? How can that possibly be? Well, here's the short answer, and obviously I'll be developing this as we go along, but the short answer is in two interconnected parts. First of all, I would say that in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Western Pennsylvania received a number of immigrants from the north of Ireland who were Presbyterian, who organized and who joined Presbyterian congregations. Of course, today there are people of many, many different backgrounds who are members of Presbyterian churches. But those folks who gave us Redup and Yuns and Nevi, who created the foundational layer of Pittsburgh speech, are also those who created the foundations of Presbyterianism in Western Pennsylvania.
Your mic is not a nice sound. Is there any way?
Yes.
Good.
That could be
below,
too.
Put it below your voice.
Technical assistance, all right.
No, don't
I
speak.
will continue to talk, and our technical wizard will resolve the situation. So that's the first part of the answer. The second, closely related second part is this, that these immigrants from the north of Ireland came in such numbers that they largely replicated the varieties of Presbyterianism in the old country, and of course added a few of their own along the way. So the existence of churches in close proximity to one another is often the result of congregations having been originally founded by different Presbyterian denominations, usually in the 19th century. And so the process continues today with various flavors of Presbyterianism, with some congregations choosing to leave the Presbyterian Church U.S.A. to join other Presbyterian denominations. What all of these churches have in common, and have had in common, and this is what will require a longer explanation, is a commitment to a Presbyterian method of church organization and an adherence in some form or another to an understanding and practice of Christianity as derived from the Reformation of the 16th century. So these two distinct but related concepts, church government and creed, are basic to our discussion. I want to spend most of my time, hopefully I will, in Western Pennsylvania and close to home, but we're going to briefly travel back in time and through space to consider the Reformation of the 16th century. Here's three things that I think you should know about the Reformation. The first is that the Catholic Church, which was the Western Christian church for centuries, was, by the beginning of the 16th century, corrupt in theology, corrupt in practice, corrupt in governance. Second, that the need to reform the church was recognized by many, including some who never left, who continued to work within the church to change it. And third, the early Protestant reformers never intended to fracture the unity of the church, what they would have regarded as the living body of Christ. They didn't intend to go off and start new denominations, but of course that's what happened. Famously, as we all know, Martin Luther took the lead in expressing and distilling the widespread dissatisfaction among Christians in Western Europe by tacking those 95 Theses to the church door in 1517. Being excommunicated by the Pope, then being declared an outlaw by the Holy Roman Emperor.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Is there someone with a red Cadillac parked in the handicap spot out there? Hi. Would you mind moving your car closer to block in? Thank you.
Okay. Right. So, Luther, this guy, excommunicated by the Pope, declared an outlaw by the Holy Roman Emperor, a circumstance which forced him to think through what it was he was saying and communicate this in a way that was clearer to everyone else as well as himself. He proclaimed that salvation, a key Christian concept, came about through faith in Jesus Christ, not as a result of performing good works. Luther challenged the authority of the Pope, and by extension his predecessors, by emphasizing the Bible as the only source of divinely revealed knowledge. and by asserting that all baptized Christians together constituted a holy priesthood. In Zurich, Switzerland, a controversial priest named Zwingli both agreed with Luther on some issues, especially the importance of the Bible, and pushed the envelope further on other issues important for the development of a Reformed theology that becomes the Presbyterian tradition. Zwingli emphasized the centrality of the sermon in worship, called for a radical rethinking of the ritual of communion, and emphasized simpler forms of worship without holy statues or holy days. A younger generation, and especially the French-born humanist scholar John Calvin, elaborated Reformation principles. Calvin emphasized human sinfulness and the possibility of salvation through God's grace, and the importance of the Bible as God's revelation. Through their study of Scripture, Calvin and his associates concluded that the properly biblical form of church government would be one based on elders or presbyters. Here's where the name comes from. It's delightfully ironic that we're meeting tonight in an Episcopalian facility, because Presbyterians and Episcopalians share this: taking the name of our denomination from the form of church government, not some theological principle or the name of a founder, but rather how the churches are organized and governed. And there's a good deal of information here, but the point is, this is also a point upon which Presbyterians and Episcopalians diverge. A conflicting interpretation of an important piece of Scripture and early Christian tradition. With, at the end of the day, we can look at the final paragraph, Episcopal refers to bishops, and so Episcopalian churches, Catholic churches, governed by bishops, whereas Presbyterian churches governed by elders chosen by their congregations. Important for the future Presbyterianism, this model was further elaborated in Scotland. Calvin's Geneva attracted the curious and the refugee. Among them, a Scots-born priest turned Protestant minister fleeing the persecution of Bloody Mary in England in the 1550s. John Knox regarded Geneva, and this is his words, the most perfect school of Christ that was ever in the earth since the days of the apostles. Knox returned to Scotland in 1559 from Geneva, bringing with him what he had learned from Calvin and his associates. Largely because of his role, Scotland's Reformation took a Reformed/Calvinist direction. After many decades of struggle with Episcopalianism, the Church of Scotland became Presbyterian, indeed the mother church of Presbyterianism. So here's what that meant: a Presbyterian form of church governance and a theology emphasizing the majesty of God, the sufficiency of God's grace for salvation, and the importance of God's word as revealed in Scripture and in sermons, together with a covenant theology which stressed the necessity of knowing God in community. And I seem to have not said more about what I wanted to say about what Presbyterian meant, the system of government. What Calvin developed was this: the idea that the properly biblical form of church government would consist of this: a session which consisted of elected elders and the minister, the presbytery, which consisted of representatives from congregations, and the synod, the highest judicatory, the highest body. But it's from the bottom up, you see. So from Scotland and John Knox, we crossed the narrow sea dividing the southwest of Scotland from the northeast of Ireland, because here in the 17th century, Scots settled in large numbers in the northern Irish province of Ulster. They organized Presbyterian congregations and presbyteries. Their Presbyterianism becoming the cultural marker that distinguished them from their neighbors. It distinguished what we can call a discernible ethno-religious group. Their Presbyterianism is what made them stand out. As the 18th century began, Presbyterians in Ireland had organized 120 congregations, 9 presbyteries, 3 sub-synods, and a general synod. And this is all largely confined to the northernmost counties. In Ulster, the Presbyterians, most of whom were tenant farmers, the overwhelming number were tenant farmers, and faced discrimination at the hands of the less numerous but socially and politically dominant Episcopalians. For reasons more economic, though, than religious or political, large numbers of Presbyterians left Ireland for America in the 18th century. In fact, during the colonial era and beyond, the majority of Irish immigrants were, in fact, Presbyterians. These are the peak. They moved throughout the colonial era, but these are the peak periods of immigration which tended to coincide with times when the rents that tenant farmers paid were drastically increased, and or bad harvest which threatened famine, and downturns in the linen industry, which had become, as a cottage industry, very important for the livelihood of these tenant farmers. Once they landed on the North American shore, these Irish Presbyterians here, well, you probably actually can't see that very well. This has turned out to be a very muddy map after all. But in thinking about the geography, once they landed on the eastern seaboard, they tended to move inland to what was the backcountry, the area between the most settled areas and the Appalachian chain, with many of them arriving in the Delaware River ports of Newcastle, Delaware, and Philadelphia. During the colonial era, their movement westward across the southern tier of Pennsylvania can be documented in 2 ways. The use of North of Ireland place names, which exist in great profusion across that southern tier, and also in the organization of Presbyterian congregations. I'll go through this very quickly. But throughout our southern Pennsylvania counties, we see both Presbyterian congregations and these place names. So many coming that on the eve of the American Revolution, an enumeration of Pennsylvania congregations, but not congregants, unfortunately, found that Presbyterians ranked 3rd after Lutherans and German Reform. Meanwhile, the Presbyterian population in western Pennsylvania in the 1770s and beyond saw a rapid increase due to a steady stream of settlers arriving in the region from eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, and directly from the north of Ireland. In what became Pittsburgh, some of the first Presbyterians were Scots serving in British regiments or who followed the army. So we have this interesting, I don't know if you can read this, but actually some of the first sermons heard in Pittsburgh, in Fort Pitt, were delivered in the Gaelic language by a Church of Scotland minister who served as chaplain to the Highland Regiment, the Black Watch. But probably, well, undoubtedly, I would say a majority of the earliest settlers, of the earliest Presbyterian settlers, had Irish connections. They were the children and the grandchildren of earlier cohorts of migrants, and there were some who had come directly themselves from the north of Ireland.
Did they call themselves Irish, or did they call themselves Scots, or Scotch-Irish, as we now say?
Typically, they call themselves Irish, but it's a question worth revisiting. Together, these various cohorts of Presbyterians of Irish origin principally organized the earliest congregations. In the river valleys of western Pennsylvania, Presbyterian congregations became the earliest, and in some places, for a time, the only religious organizations. Settlers in Westmoreland County organized 7 Presbyterian congregations before the Revolutionary War and 5 more prior to 1795. Fairly early. Those are just a few. Salem Presbyterian Church in Derry Township was organized by several interrelated families who left the lower Band Valley of northern County Derry in 1772. All had been members of the Presbyterian congregation in the parish of Dunbow, near Coleraine. 10 Presbyterian congregations were organized in Allegheny County between 1771 and 1794. 7 of them by 1790. One of the first residents of Squirrel Hill was an Irish-born man named James Milligan, who was among the original elders of Beulah Church. And in the 1780s, he became the first elder to be chosen as his congregation's commissioner to presbytery meetings. In Washington County, 19 Presbyterian congregations were organized between 1774 and 1798. 13 of them prior to 1790. According to one scholar, the largest proportion of Presbyterian churches to be found in any county west of the Alleghenies. And these are just a few of them. As in the colonial era settlements east of the mountains, Presbyterianism in post-revolutionary Western Pennsylvania included both the mainstream Presbyterian church and the smaller Presbyterian denominations arising from Scottish controversies and nurtured by Irish conditions. These were the Reformed Presbyterian Church, or Covenanters, the Associate Presbyterian Church, or Seceders, and after 1782, a new American denomination, the Associate Reformed Church. And yes, here we have a few examples of same. In areas of fairly dense Irish Presbyterian settlement, these smaller denominations and their devotion to old world traditions represented an alternative to the mainstream church. Areas that experienced substantial numbers of Irish Presbyterian settlers tended to have more than one variety of Presbyterianism represented, which helps explain the profusion. The mainstream church in the 1760s and beyond attempted to achieve a degree of cohesion and order as settlements developed over an extensive territory. In the fall of, wait a minute, how embarrassing. Okay, the Donegal Presbytery, which took its name from the church you saw perhaps in an earlier slide, located in Lancaster County, not the place you would think of today as a heartland of Presbyterianism, and yet so many of the names in Lancaster County are of Irish origin. In any event, the Donegal Presbytery, based in the older Ulster settlements east of the mountains, had the responsibility for organizing congregations, regulating sessions, and dispatching ministers in the territory, this great territory west of the Susquehanna River, leading in 1781 to the organization of the Redstone Presbytery, the first presbytery to be organized west of the mountains. And that was followed in 1793 by the creation of the Presbytery of Ohio out of the Redstone Presbytery. Now, you might think that with a name like the Presbytery of Ohio, this has something to do with Ohio, with the state of Ohio. Not necessarily so. It had a responsibility for the area, well, whatever settled area there was west of the Monongahela River, in parts of what is now Ohio and West Virginia, but mainly in that southwestern corner of Pennsylvania between the Ohio and the Mon. When the Ohio Presbytery was created in 1793, there were just 5 ministers responsible for more than 20 congregations in this largely frontier area. Continuing population growth within the region and among Presbyterians led to further reorganization in the early 19th century. And I'm not sure what happened there. Well, in any event, so that slide is a whole lot less edifying than I thought it might be. In any event, I'm going to briefly look at the experience of one particular Irish Presbyterian immigrant in the years following the War of Independence, because I think it provides kind of an interesting snapshot. A native of County Derry, Reverend Samuel Barr was born in a farming household in 1751. Like most of the candidates for the Presbyterian ministry in Ireland, he attended Glasgow University. You might think to yourself, well, that must be because of their affinity to Scotland. No, it had more to do with the fact that Presbyterians were barred from Trinity College. But that's still another story. He completed his studies in 1783, was licensed to preach, and very quickly decided that he wanted to cross the ocean to see what was going on in the United States. He alighted in New London, Chester County, in eastern Pennsylvania, and could have easily made his home there. He received a call from that congregation. But the reports from west of the mountains piqued his interest. And so in the fall of 1785, not long after their wedding, Barr and his young bride set off for Pittsburgh on horseback. By the end of the year, he had received and accepted a call to be the minister of the United Congregation of Pittsburgh and Pitt Township. By Pitt Township, we mean what's now Church Hill because of the church on the hill. That was the church. Pittsburgh's Presbyterian congregation was the only English-speaking church in the village at the time, and not all of its members would have considered themselves to be Presbyterians. I'm glad that slide came through more or less intact. So what you see represented here is sketched very briefly the story of Barr's falling out with certain prominent members of his congregation who were actually Episcopalians. They just hadn't gotten around to organizing Trinity Cathedral yet. And he ran afoul of them. This is a very truncated version of the story. These congregants, these influential congregants, represented the elite of the region at the time. They were Episcopalians of English or Anglo-Irish origin, and they had little in common with their minister, the son of an Irish farmer. Barr's criticism of Pittsburgh's politically powerful heightened a sense of mutual unease, and he left the village on bad terms with congregational officers. But that wasn't true of his relationship with his other congregation, the one out in the hill at Pitt Township, what would become Beulah Church. These rural folk, many of them also the children of Irish farmers, praised Barr's ministry, including his elder, James Milligan of Squirrel Hill. In the countryside and in the village that was becoming a town, the development of Presbyterianism in western Pennsylvania relied on continuing immigration from Ulster, relocation from elsewhere in Pennsylvania, and natural increase. For the most part, the 18th century immigrants looked for land, and that continued to be true in the 19th century, although gradually newcomers looked to economic opportunities in town. I'll take questions at the end if you don't mind. Hold those thoughts. In between, the region received exiles from the revolutionary movements of the 1790s, which sought unsuccessfully to create an independent Irish republic. In the north of Ireland, the revolutionary movement to create a separate Irish republic was primarily Presbyterian. Among the exiles, Reverend Robert Steele who was the minister of the Presbyterian congregation in Dungiven, County Derry. He came to Pittsburgh, typical story really, in part because his brother, William, was already here. His brother was a merchant who had a shop on Wood Street. Steele became the second settled minister of the Pittsburgh congregation. Joseph Carr came from a family deeply involved in the secession church, the seceders in the old country, and heavily implicated in the radical politics of the time. After his arrival in this region early in the 19th century, Carr was called to be minister to the Associate Reformed Congregation of Sawmill Run, which later became better known perhaps as Mount Lebanon United Presbyterian Church. Carr would later serve the Associate Reformed Congregation in the town of Pittsburgh. The Covenanters in Ulster were predisposed to opposition to the British state and disproportionately supported the rebellion. A young man forced into exile, John Black, became the first minister to be called by the Reformed Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh. In Pittsburgh itself, the development of Presbyterianism in the early 19th century was especially driven and shaped by social class, economic difference, and political rivalries. Pittsburgh's mainstream Presbyterian congregation split into two in the early 1800s, in a division which seems to have had more to do with political as religious differences. That's when the Pittsburgh Presbyterian congregation became first, and the other one became second. And we know where that went from there. In the first decade of the 19th century, Pittsburgh had both a noticeable Irish presence and two Presbyterian churches and a Reformed Presbyterian meeting house among the town's 6 church buildings. A description of Pittsburgh's population in 1824 listed the Irish first among the nationalities represented. In a city which was reported as having 8 churches, 4 Presbyterian, with 1 each for Catholics, Episcopalians, Lutherans, and Methodists. Catholics had only the small church by the canal, what became St. Patrick's. An indirect indication that at this point in time, the Irish ethnicity would have applied mostly to the Presbyterians. Significantly, the Presbyterian congregations also included those of the Associate and Reformed Presbyterian denominations, favored disproportionately by recent immigrants. Unsurprisingly, an immigrant Methodist in Pittsburgh, writing to an acquaintance in County Monaghan in 1834, proposed that the Presbyterians and Covenanters are the most numerous in this part of the country. This region, in fact, became the stronghold of the Associate Reformed, and Reformed Presbyterian churches, the Seceders and the Covenanters. In 1858, in Pittsburgh, downtown Pittsburgh, the Associate and Associate Reformed churches merged, creating the United Presbyterian Church, a denomination that lasted for 100 years. In 1958, again in downtown Pittsburgh, the United Presbyterian Church merged with the Presbyterian Church. And when much of the Southern Church coalesced with this body in 1983, today's U.S.A. was created. To conclude with a somewhat exemplary story set very close to home. In 1825, a faithful farmer, as he was known, and a devout Presbyterian, born and raised in County Down in the north of Ireland, came to America and eventually settled in Pittsburgh. Eventually, James Whiteman and his wife Martha Smiley settled here, and here their son Thomas, also born in Ireland and also a Presbyterian, became involved in the glass manufacturing industry and was very, very successful. You might know where I'm going with this. If you looked at the maps that Helen set out on the credenza, you will have noticed property owned by Thomas Whiteman. Whiteman built himself a magnificent home on the 10 acres he owned between Murray Avenue and, yes, you guessed it, Whiteman Street. Meanwhile, another glass manufacturer, this time an English immigrant, launched a Sunday school class in his factory. This, over time, became Sixth Presbyterian Church. At nearly the same time, a small Presbyterian congregation became organized in that corner of rural Allegheny County that was later known, that we know as Squirrel Hill. The two merged once demographic changes led to the relocation of Sixth Presbyterian Church to the place we know it today, at the corner of Forbes and Murray. And so at the church down the street, we have the continuing story and a continuing affirmation of the love of God through community. Thank you. And now, those questions. Yes, please.
When I was a little boy in school, we were always taught that Pennsylvania was given to the Quakers and they had pretty much control. Now, was there a rivalry between the Presbyterians, or did the Quakers invite them in or welcome them in, or just how did this happen?
Both. The man who was William Penn's secretary and who became the provincial secretary, James Logan, was himself from the north of Ireland. He came from Logan in County Armagh. And he encouraged the movement of Presbyterians from the north of Ireland to the Pennsylvania frontier, which was then Lancaster County, in the 17-teens, 1720s. And then it just took on a life of its own. The humble flax plant had a good deal to do with it. I mentioned the linen industry. Under the mercantilist laws that so perplexed and bothered American colonists, the English Parliament also banned the importation from Ireland into England of various manufactured goods and agricultural produce, but they didn't restrict trade in linen. And so tenant farmers in the north of Ireland found they could make extra money by growing flax, turning it into linen thread, and then weaving linen cloth. And over time, this became so profitable that families would rent land just to have a place for their cottage and to set up a loom and a spinning wheel, and chose to use every bit of the flax plant for linen production, which meant that they looked elsewhere for flax seed. And they looked to the colonies of North America. And so every year, ships would sail from Philadelphia full of flax seed and would come back to Philadelphia with immigrants. And this became such a successful and notable practice that it became a business unto itself. Enterprising ship captains would hire agents to go about the north of Ireland trying to convince people to emigrate in their vessels. And so you see what happened. There was a dynamic that unfolded. By the time of the Revolution, though, those Presbyterians had become quite disenchanted with the political and social dominance of the Quakers, and actually by this time the Anglicans had supplanted the Quakers. Here I go with that. I'm not going to report this headlines again, but it's a fact. So, in fact, in 1776, you might recall, or by 1776, the Pennsylvania political leadership was reluctant, comparatively, to get involved in a quarrel with the mother country, with Great Britain. And the Continental Congress kind of gave folks in Pennsylvania a little nudge and said, it would be okay, in fact we recommend that in those states where there hasn't been a new revolutionary constitution put in place, that states do that. So there was a revolution within the revolution. The two groups that had been excluded by the Quakers and the Anglicans, the German Reformed and the Presbyterians, coalesced, took over the state government, made it very difficult, if not impossible, for the Quakers, the Anglicans, to actually run for office and be elected, and then proceeded to create what at the time was the world's most radical democratic state constitution, or constitution of any kind, which unusually for the world in 1776 gave virtually every adult male the right to vote. Now, that may not, to many of those in the room, that might not seem so radical. It's unfortunate women would have to wait to vote, but for 1776, this was crazy stuff. You mean let anybody vote, even if they don't own property or have a lot of wealth? But that's what this coalition of Presbyterians and Quakers did in 1776, and then they went on 4 years later to be the first legislature anywhere in the world to begin to abolish slavery. Now, understand that we should recognize that Pennsylvania's Act for the Gradual Emancipation of Slaves had many difficulties, but it was also the first attempt by any legislative body anywhere in the world to eliminate slavery. That was not done by the Quakers, ladies and gentlemen. It was done by this coalition of Presbyterians and German Reform. I hope that answered your question. Dr. Parker.
Well, I don't think if I missed something. The slide on Reverend Barr.
Ah, yes.
Yeah. So, did you explain why he refused to marry, to conduct this marriage that ended up alienating him from
I didn't. Barr did a number of things which annoyed those respectable members of his congregation. And he was warned about this. So I'm sure many of you have heard of Hugh Henry Brackenridge, lawyer, judge, poet, novelist. He had encouraged Barr to settle in Pittsburgh, but he warned him, don't broadcast the fact that you're a Calvinist. There are people here who aren't that particularly interested in your religious views. We need a minister because who would help, bring up the tone of the place. And Barr was not that kind of guy. He was a Presbyterian from the north of Ireland, and he knew what he believed in, and he was not going to be shy about enunciating those beliefs. And so that was the beginning of his difficulty. His refusal to marry the children of Ormsby, the daughter of Ormsby and Nathaniel Bedford, may have had something to do with the fact that they were actually Episcopalians, and he had some doctrinal problems with them. He also refused to baptize a child of John Gibson, who had been the commandant of Fort Pitt. Gibson was another Episcopalian who was attending the Presbyterian congregation. It might also have it had to do with the fact that Gibson had extramarital connections with certain Native American women, and so there might have been questions of parentage. I'm not really sure, but these were among several things that Barr did that did not endear him to the congregation. The Ormsby Bedford marriage was maybe the most spectacular, simply because you just didn't say no to these people. They owned all of the South Side, for heaven's sakes. He was also when Barr went before the Presbytery to ask for a letter of dismission, his walking papers, his formal walking papers, so that he could go someplace else and be a minister. That meeting Presbytery turned into a trial of Barr, with a succession of leading Pittsburghers talking about all the miserable, bad things that he had done, including being engaged in negotiations with an emissary of the Spanish emperor to turn Western Pennsylvania into a Spanish province. There's a reason for that. Under a treaty that had been under a treaty between the United States and Spain, or rather between the United States and Britain, shipping was prohibited. between Pittsburgh and New Orleans. And this would have been ruinous to farmers who depended on sending their produce down the river. And so there were actually, I don't think Barr was personally involved, but there were some figures, political figures in what's now Kentucky and Tennessee who actually did have some discussions with imperial representatives about the possibility of splitting those portions of the United States west of the Appalachians and turning them over to Spain. But it's a somewhat of a complex story. I hope I answered your question. Yes.
I'm particularly interested in the Covenanters and their effort in the 19th century to pass a constitutional amendment to have God as mentioned in the Constitution.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about that?
Look, here's the thing about the Covenanters, which is so astonishing, really. Their reason for existence was an amalgam of religious and political concepts. The word covenant for them goes back to two documents in the 17th century. The National Covenant of Scotland in 1638, in which the Scottish people pledged to do away with Episcopalian government, because that's what the king would do if he was really thinking. And the 1643 Solemn League and Covenant. So remember, there's this revolution or civil war in England, and the English are looking for assistance from the Scots. The Scottish Presbyterians, the more radical Scottish Presbyterians, are in the ascendancy, and they say, okay, we will agree to support you militarily, but we want a pledge between you and us and the Almighty that we will work together to remove Catholicism and Episcopalianism from the British Isles. That was later repudiated by everybody but them. And so they maintained this dogged, lonely insistence that this commitment made to God should be carried forward. So they regarded the British Constitution as immoral, which is what made them more willing to be, in the north of Ireland, to be responsive to revolutionary currents. Well, when those revolutionary exiles came to the United States, they had a problem. How do we make sense of our historic beliefs in a new context? The first authoritative word on this subject came in a sermon preached in the Pittsburgh area in the early 1800s on a text from Zechariah. And basically what the minister had to say was this, that immigrants should not, in good conscience, swear allegiance to the United States of America because the U.S. Constitution is immoral. It's immoral because the Constitution, and by the way, you hear people say, well, the United States is a Christian nation. Well, you wouldn't know it by reading these sermons by the Covenanters. The U.S. Constitution is immoral because it doesn't explicitly refer to God. It does not recognize the headship of Jesus Christ. It does not ban idolaters and heretics from serving in office, and it recognizes slavery. The Covenanters, there was no more fervent, consistent, anti-slavery denomination in the United States than the Covenanters. And their opposition to slavery was part of why they rejected the U.S. Constitution. But they also disliked the Constitution because of those other elements, that there was no explicit reference to Christianity, to Jesus Christ, to God. And so one of their attempts to deal with this in a public concerted way that went beyond their own ranks was their participation circa 1860 in something called the National Reform Association, in which they sought changes to the U.S. Constitution that would create explicit recognition of the role of Jesus Christ in government.
And this was the center of it, right, in this area?
Yes, I mean, it's we were having a conversation about this earlier. The Reformed Presbyterian Church actually split in 1833, basically in response to Jacksonian democracy. There was a group that wanted to participate in American democracy, and the more conservative wing still would have nothing of it. It was only within within our lifetimes, that they were allowed to vote. And that surviving portion of the Reformed Presbyterian Church has its national headquarters in Pittsburgh on Penn Avenue. Judy?
What's the connection between the Presbyterian Church and the Freemasonry, they call it the Scottish Rite? And was that somehow connected? Because I think Nathaniel Bedford, have you ever seen the grave in person? It's the one that's downtown.
Yeah, well,
It's got because he was pretty famous as a Freemason.
Freemasonry, I suppose, by its nature, is kind of shadowy. There is and there isn't some overlap. Some of the actually many of the Presbyterian ministers who took part in the 1798 rebellion in Ireland turn out to have been Masons. On the other hand, some of these smaller denominations, the Associate and Associate Reformed churches, prohibited members from having anything to do with any secret society, and in this area formed the backbone of what was one of the most successful ever third-party movements in the United States, the Anti-Mason Party. Yes?
Is Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh in particular one of the largest Presbyterian areas of settlement in this country?
I would say yes. I mean, the proportion of Presbyterians to the general population has declined over the last 50 years or so, but it's still, it has been and remains a center in that respect, yes.
Sorry, you made a few references to this earlier, and I'm sorry if you discussed it before I got here, but you talked about there being more congregations occasionally than congregants, practically. And I wondered, you made it sound as if there were a large number of rifts even within Presbyterianism. And I wondered or reasons for there to be so many distinct congregations. And I wondered if those reasons were theological or political or geographic or something else entirely.
There were more Presbyterians than congregations, and more congregations than there were ministers. Let me make that clear. One of the unique, I think, and important aspects of the story of Presbyterianism in this region, its earliest days, is that it was organized from below. Rather than someone coming in and setting up a congregation, families met together to worship on their own, to sing songs, to pray. The arrival of the minister became a catalyst for the creation of a congregation, but these folks were self-starters in that respect. There were a number of different denominations, and those denominations were the result of inherited controversies from the old countries, but also reactions to changes in American religious practice. The biggest driver was, this will shock you, hymns, singing hymns. It tore families apart. It tore entire villages apart because the way things were done back in the north of Ireland and in Scotland was people would sing the Psalms using about 36 tunes that had been circulated for a couple hundred years. That's what you sang. And every congregation had a presenter whose job it was to sing out a line, and then the congregation would come behind. And that was an integral part of worship. Then in the late 18th century, after the American Revolution, some daring, innovative congregations started using hymn books. And don't you know, that created quite a stir. So there's more than one congregation that was split down the middle by the introduction of hymns. You might have remembered seeing the slide of Bethel. Bethel being one of the oldest congregations in Allegheny County. When the minister introduced the Psalms of Isaac Watt, a number of the congregants got up and left, and they're the ones who constituted themselves, for the most part, as the Associate Reformed Congregation of Sawmill Run, which later became the St. Clair Congregation, which became the Mount Lebanon United Presbyterian Church. So that big, imposing building on the corner of Scott Road and Washington Road began as a protest movement within Bethel Church over the Psalms. And then later, in the 19th century, some daring congregations introduced organs. Well, we're not having that. And people got up and left and went off and joined the UP Church, or prior to 1858. Well, this is probably all after 1858. They would have joined the UP Church, or if not that, the Associate Reformed, or the Reformed Presbyterian Church.
Yes, sir.
With the Underground Railroad, whenever we see citations about Presbyterian involvement, generally the congregations identified themselves as Freer, Covenanters, or Succeeders. Is there a blanket terminology that might cover those groups?
Probably not. I mean, the closest that I'm aware of is one that Dr. Reed Stewart uses, which is Scottish dissenting churches. Another historian referred to them as the high church tradition in Presbyterianism. Neither are completely satisfactory. So I don't think there is. But you're right, you're absolutely correct in identifying those particular varieties of Presbyterianism with the Underground Railroad, with the slavery movement, anti-slavery movement in general. The Free Presbyterian Church was, another small denomination that lasted for about 10, 15 years. Closer to 20 years, I suppose, which was a defection from the mainstream Presbyterian Church over the issue of slavery. They were a traditional Presbyterian denomination in every respect except this. Anyone who had anything to do with slavery was barred from communion. It just so happens that last month I was looking at the session minutes of a little Free Presbyterian congregation in Armstrong County. A group of the members circulated a petition and brought it to session complaining that one of the members of the congregation had voted the Republican ticket. Can you imagine that? And the reason they were up in arms was they didn't think the Republican Party was sufficiently abolitionist. They didn't trust that Lincoln guy. He said he was going to preserve the Union and not worry about slavery. So that was not okay for them. So yeah, there was this group of dissident, we might say, dissident dissenting Presbyterians who were very, very strong on the issue of slavery. Yes, ma'am.
You said that they were anti-constitution, a lot of
The Covenanters specifically.
just the one group.
Yeah, that's right.
Because I was reading in this little pamphlet that said that at least 14 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Presbyterians.
True enough.
Including clergyman John
Witherspoon, that's right. He was a signer.
So they must have been part of the government that they formed.
There were these different varieties of Presbyterianism, these different denominations. Witherspoon was the leader of the mainstream, the largest, denomination. The Covenanters were a small group, although particularly numerous in Pennsylvania. And they're the ones who had this historic descent, first from the British Constitution, then to the American Constitution.
Can you say something about educational institutions in Western Pennsylvania that were founded by Presbyterians?
Well, that's quite a list, and that's something I noted in Helen's column in the latest Squirrel Hill magazine. The importance which Presbyterians placed on education. Today's Washington and Jefferson University began as two separate schools. You would not be surprised to know they were called Washington College and Jefferson College. The University of Pittsburgh had, as you may have had in the slide, had as its first principal, or the forerunner of the University of Pittsburgh, had as its first principal Reverend Robert Steele. There were many other Presbyterian ministers and lay people involved in the formation of the University of Pittsburgh. Such a long list, really.
Westminster College.
I mean, yeah. If you think of a regional college or university that was not set up as part of the state system, chances are it has some kind of Presbyterian antecedents, and that spreads across the border to the College of Worcester, Miami, University of Ohio, and so on and so forth. Bethany in West Virginia was founded by a splinter group from the Presbyterians, and so it goes. Grove City, Westminster,
Carnegie.
Geneva, further east, Dickinson, Princeton, of course. It's a very long list. Education was regarded as very important, and actually the plans that John Knox unveiled for Scotland back in the 1560s included a plan for universal education, because it was regarded as, I mean, it wasn't carried out right away, alas, but it was regarded as essential that everyone have access to the Word of God, which meant they had to have an education. So education was always very important, and a lot of emphasis was placed on the importance of an educated clergy. One thing that makes Western Pennsylvania different from the other areas in the Appalachian chain that received what might be called a heavy Scotch-Irish population is that while those folks ended up becoming Baptists or Methodists, people here stayed Presbyterian. The reason for the defection had to do in part with the difficulty of finding a clergyman that met the standards set by the church, because they had to have an education. They had to be able to read Greek and Hebrew. Of course, that's still true. Yeah, Helen?
What about Presbyterians today? They exerted a lot of influence even into the robber baron era, but can you say a little bit about today?
Well, of course, the robber baron era is not today, although it is today. Although it's a different cast of characters. I mean, in terms of the post-Civil War period, it's a question of timing and location, right? Timing and location. They were here first. They were here first, and they were here in numbers, and they, like probably every ethnic group, people recommended friends and neighbors and cousins and nephews and siblings for jobs, and so it happened. When young Thomas Whiteman arrived in Pittsburgh, he found a job in a glass factory owned by William McAdoo. Well, I think McAdoo. Anyway, and when Thomas Mellon was a young lawyer starting out, he rubbed shoulders with people of a similar background as him, others who were the children or grandchildren of Irish immigrants who were Presbyterian. So the advantage of being here early, of being here earlier than others, gave them an advantage in acquiring property and amassing capital, which they did not have a lot of upon arrival. There's a world of difference between the situation that prevailed, say, in the 1780s and that which prevailed in the 1880s. And I'm actually, to be quite honest, I know much less about the 20th century than I do the 19th and the 18th century. But we can see certainly continuing influence, both politically and socially, based on the wealth and the prosperity enjoyed in the high point of America's Industrial Revolution after the Civil War. Yes?
Could you say a few words about why the Scots that were Presbyterians found it necessary to go to Ulster County?
Basically the same reason that brought them to North America. That so important four-letter word, land. They were very poor tenant farmers or landless laborers in the south of Scotland who wanted land. They wanted to be able to rent land for their farms at a reasonable rent. And the northeastern counties of Ireland had been not completely decimated, but had been devastated by a ruinous war at the end of the 16th century. So there was a degree of depopulation, there was a degree to which land had been let go. And so the new English and Scottish landowners, mainly English, were very happy to recruit Scots who would be willing to come over and rent the land, work and develop the land. That's what brought them there. And then as rents began to be increased dramatically in combination with political and religious discrimination they faced at the hands of the Episcopalian elite, combined with downturns in the linen trade, that's what brought them to these shores. But it was the usual story, economic deprivation, and the fact that the grass looked greener, 15, 20 miles across the water, that made them undertake that short voyage. Yes?
Yeah, I have an ancestor that came to North America in the 1640s, who was Scots-Irish Presbyterian and a weaver. And I wanted you to expand on, because that seems like a very important aspect of this migration from Ulster to North America. Could you expand on that? And it's important to me because I have an ancestor who was actually a weaver.
Well, weaving was a trade which attracted many folks in the countryside. This was literally a cottage industry. People whose parents may have been mostly farmers became mostly weavers themselves, growing their own food, everyone in the family taking part in the cloth production, women spinning, the men weaving, and that was an important means of livelihood. And it's what allowed them to pay the rent, pay the hated tithe to the Church of Ireland, the Episcopalian Church. It's what allowed them to enjoy some degree of prosperity, some sense of independence. And when those things were under threat, they made the move.
And why were they under threat?
The things I mentioned earlier, the rack renting, as it was called, the drastic increases in rent they paid for their plots of land, or downturns in the linen industry, when there was, say, a glut and prices dropped and they were getting less for their labor. And so again, the possibility of something better on the other side of the ocean, the grass looking greener.
One question, this was the working class, and the architecture is incredible. Where did all the people come from that built these churches?
Well, keep in mind that the first churches were log cabins. And by the all those churches that I mentioned that were built during the 1770s and the 1780s, those were log cabins. And in the 1820s and 1830s, they began to be replaced by brick buildings. And so when we get to the second half of the 19th century, at this point, in some cases, several generations out from the first folks who came over. As I said earlier, in answer to Helen's question, we're beginning to encounter folks who have acquired some money, sometimes a good deal of money.
Education.
Yes, and they're willing to put their money where they pray, I guess we could say, and build those magnificent edifices. But we're lucky, I suppose, to have churches like Third Presbyterian on Nagley and Fifth, and Shady Side Presbyterian, and all the other large monumental churches, not to mention the way over the top East Liberty Presbyterian. But if you go out to the countryside, if you go out into Beaver or Washington County, where there are still many rural Presbyterian congregations, they look a lot like they do in the north of Ireland. Small, unostentatious, box-like buildings that contain fairly austere worship services inside. So they are truer to what the ancestors might have looked for or expected in a church. So there's a lot of egos that have been memorialized in the construction of some of these magnificent edifices.
The Scotch-Irish leaning towards the frontiers, where they could set up like tomahawk claims
Yes.
rather than buy land. Is that because of poverty, or they're just too feisty to live around anybody else?
Poverty, you know, there's an image, or a myth really, that's let me back up a little bit. Maybe I'm being too harsh unnecessarily. When people typically talk about the quote-unquote Scotch-Irish, the adjective that almost always comes up is independent. Oh, they were so independent. And no one has ever adequately explained to me what the heck that means. The reality that I see in the historical record is people emphasizing community, living in community. So instead of, the image we might have of the mountain man going off by themselves where they can be completely alone and have no communion except with the bears and the beavers, they seek each other out. The fact that there are all those Presbyterian congregations from Chester County west to the West Virginia line is because people chose to settle together in family groups, recreating bonds of family and friendship and congregational communalism that they had known back in the old country. And that's how they lived their lives. That was the basis of their religious practice. So I don't think it's so much a question of their being feisty, but rather being dirt poor. They came to Pennsylvania because rent was cheap, but for some of them it wasn't cheap enough. And so some of them famously squatted, declaring that it was a sin to let all that land go without anybody living on it. And so regardless of what the pen said or what the provincial authority said, they set up their cabins anyway. You had a question, didn't you, sir?
I did.
Yes.
I think you covered it. I was thinking that Judge Thomas Mellon was an immigrant from Northern Ireland and a Presbyterian.
He was. He's my favorite anti-example, in a sense. I mean, he is in some ways exemplary of his generation and the generation of the robber barons. But if we're looking at those who came over, say, before the 1840s, before the Civil War, certainly, he's very much unlike his father's generation. His father wanted him to be a farmer. Thomas Mellon wanted to be rich. He realized he was not going to be rich if he were a farmer like his father. So he deliberately chose to become a lawyer. He deliberately sought out the daughter of the richest man in the area, Nagley, Alexander Nagley, married his daughter, Sarah. And once in his youth, he considered the possibility of being a minister as opposed to being a farmer, and decided he was going to make nearly enough money doing that. So he decided on law. But his sense of Presbyterianism, his sense of values were very much unlike those of his father or his father's generation.
Much more mercenary.
Indeed,
Yeah.
indeed. Which wasn't actually true of that older generation. I could go on at some length on that question, but I don't suppose we have the opportunity.
Any more questions? One more question?
Those are the ones that built the churches, though.
Yeah, well, the churches that we know now. There would have been churches, but they would, without them, but they would not be magnificent. That's the difference.
Did they import labor to build the churches? Who
I
were-
don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. Quite possibly.
And you can see an example right at Beulah Church in Churchill.
Right.
Small.
Thank you, Helen. That's very true. So there's the modern Beulah Presbyterian Church, which large sanctuary, classrooms, library, a gym with a basketball court, for heaven's sakes. But right next door, in front of the churchyard, is the simple, plain little country church that had served people in that area for many, many generations. That's more in keeping with the values and the visual sense of those early Presbyterians.
I have just a corollary to that in Turner Graveyard, you might know that I researched it, which is tied in a way to the Methodist Church, although it's a community graveyard. Well, Rachel Castleman is buried there, but her husband, Jake, didn't want anything to do with the Methodist. He was Presbyterian, so he is in Beulah. He's carved all the way. And Castleman Street in Shadyside is that family. Their daughter married one of the Aikens. But Jake is in he's over in Beulah. Rachel we have.
Continuing to bear witness.
But